If you have your Bibles this morning, I hope you all do, let's turn to Genesis chapter 1. We are studying through the book of Genesis, and this morning, Lord willing, we will get through chapter 3, so you can tell how deep we're going to get into it. We're not going to get very deep at all. But we're going to be focusing on one special topic, which I believe is a major subject in the Bible, of crucial importance, and it's really basic to our worldview. Every one of us who names the name of Christ this morning, we think a certain way about this subject, and what we think about this subject actually affects the way we live, the choices we make. Before I read in Genesis, let me just read you a paragraph or two written by Isaac Asimov, who many of you might know as a science fiction writer. He's also a non-Christian. And this was came out of an introductory page that he wrote for a psychology textbook. If humanity has advanced through its history, it has been through the activity of the human brain, which has brought us material security in every aspect of culture. And if humanity has been placed in danger, it has been through the activity of the human brain. For it is human motivations, carefully thought out and justified by the brain, greed, envy, rage, lust, that produce the wars, violence, alienation, cruelties that other motivations, sympathy, love, desire to give and build and create, fight so endlessly. What can possibly be more important than to understand both the destructive and constructive aspects of human thought, emotion, and personality in order that we might fight the one and encourage the other? Sounds good, doesn't it? Very important to understand what we are, where our minds came from. It's very important to focus in on the human being and to delve into the mysteries of human nature and understand it. And I'm not belittling the science of psychology at all, because psychology is really just a natural science. It is, it's one of those normal, everyday activities that, like it or not, interested or not in psychology per se, every one of us is in the process of doing. We are constantly evaluating one another's thoughts. We're developing relationships with other people. We are analyzing. We make decisions based on our concept of what other people are like and the world around us, and that's really psychology, and the science of thought and the mind. The problem with Isaac Asimov's evaluation is that there is something more important to understand than just man, and that is God and His view of man. And what is totally lacking in secular books like this is the idea that God has any relevant place in the mind and in the emotions and in the history and in the goals and motivations of man. You take a psychology course and they will leave God out. They leave God out of science, of all the sciences. They try to exclude Him from history, relegating Him to mere ideas that people back in history had. If you study the religion in university, it will usually be put on the same par as any one of the other. Christianity will be put on the same par as any other one of the world religions. You may study it in depth, but who's to say it is truth? Right? And so the great problem that the world has when it looks at man is that it leaves God out. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. The Christian worldview of man is very different, is radically different, is tremendously opposed to the ideas about people that are floating around in our schools and in the workplace and in society in general. Your neighbor probably has a different viewpoint of who he is or what she is like and why she is in the world than you do, or they ought to have a different viewpoint. if they're non-Christians than you. You ought to have a very different viewpoint of who you are and why you are here than people in the world. And that's what we're looking at in Genesis chapters 1 to 3 this morning, the Christian world viewpoint. The nature of man and the purpose of life are inseparably tied together. Some people would argue that there is no purpose in life. We are just here, like dogs. When we die, that's it. There is no purpose. Enjoy it while you can. That's a very current philosophy. There are some people that don't believe there are any absolutes, that you can know nothing for sure. And because, having studied the Bible and because I'm convinced that it is truth, that it really is knowledge from heaven to earth, our comments this morning are going to be based on what God says about man, and that's very comforting to know what God has said about man. It's very illuminating to know what God has said about man, and it's very motivating as well to live a certain kind of life. David asked a question one day. It's recorded in Psalm 8. What is man? And he was speaking to God. What is man, that you are mindful of him? And the Son of Man, that thou visitest him. What is so special about us that God would be interested in us? I believe that's a very natural response, because anybody that's really honest with themselves knows that they are rotten to the core, as we were talking about this morning. Our spirits are darkened, our flesh is depraved, our soul is twisted, our bodies are, we abuse them. Man has really advanced technologically, but as far as his understanding, his value of other human beings goes, it has not kept par. And it's because of the fundamental source of their knowledge. They're looking at man and his depraved nature, and of course you're never going to come up with anything good, anything final and determinative when you just look at people. However, David looked at himself and he knew there was a God. And he said, God, why are you interested in me? David was a murderer and an adulterer, and there was no solution for the problems that he had gone through except the grace of God. And really, if we're honest with ourselves, according to the ultimate standard of God today, we know just how much we have failed. We know. If we're honest with ourselves, if we know what God says about life, we know that our thoughts, our motives, the things we value, even in our relationships as parents and husbands and wives, we fail constantly. Constantly we come short. So why does God bother with us? I'll tell you why. Because we are like God. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, it tells us that God said in the divine council of the Godhead there during the creation week, God said to himself, let us make man in our image. You see, this reference to us and our indicates that there is a plurality in the Godhead. And there was a council held before man ever was formed in the world. And God said, let's make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So that was the divine design, and the 27th verse gives us the historical fact. So, because of what God decided to do, God did create man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Now this is a very mysterious thing. In what way are we in the image and the likeness of God? Is God male? Is he female? This is an absurd discussion that's going on in many religious groups today. It makes no difference. God is a spirit. Right? That's not what he's referring to when you're talking about the image and the likeness of God. There are other things that are more important than mere biological, physical characteristics. God is a spirit. He's not a body. He doesn't have a body like we are. So that's irrelevant. We are made in the image and the likeness of God. What does that mean? Well, the very first thing I want to draw out of this morning, this is a major point that we're going to focus on for a little bit, is that we're important to God because, number one, our nature, by its very creation, in the very beginning, man was made like God. And that there's some tremendous ramifications that come out of that. We're told in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, that Jesus was in the express image of his Father. We're told in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, that Jesus Christ was in God's image, and the same thing in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Apparently, God has an image. There is something to God. He is not just a nebulous, formless, characterless, indescribable force or another. There is something to God. He is described as having an image. And Jesus Christ, when He came into the world, told His disciples plainly, I have come to show you the Father. He that has seen me has seen the Father. In His image, in His spiritual image, Jesus Christ demonstrated what God was really like in His character, in His nature. Now, when God started this whole ball rolling, and when He decided to make men and women, He made them in His image. That means that we are like God. Now, today, there is an element of truth that has been blown all out of proportion in many world religions. The Mormons, the Hindus, the Buddhists, there are lots of people around today that will tell you, will argue, you can become God. We are God. If there is a God, we are it. And this is current in our philosophy today. In our society, we are being bombarded with this confusing idea that there is no real difference between God and people, that we are God. That it's possible for us to actually become God. The truth of the matter, according to the Bible, is that we are God-like, but we will never become God. There is a world of difference between being God and being like God. And the Bible teaches that man was made like God, whatever that means. Evolutionists have a terrible time, as I was saying this morning. Isaac Asimov, if he was backed into a corner, would not be able to explain why human beings love. Because basically we're dirt. Dirt doesn't feel, it doesn't love, it doesn't hate, it doesn't plan, it doesn't have motivations, it doesn't have self-conceptions. Where did the immaterial come from? You know where it came from? We are made in the image of God. No animal was made in the image of God. You read through the previous portion of this chapter and you will see that God created every living creature that moved. He gave to them breath of life. And because God gave them an immaterial nature, they have instinct, they have something that is soulish, but they don't have minds like men. They don't have souls and spirits like men, as we're going to see. And there's a commentary on Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, over in chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it says, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. Animals have what is in the Hebrew called a nephesh, a soul. And this is the same word. Man became a living nephesh. Jehovah's Witnesses want to argue that because animals have nephesh and man has nephesh, that eventually when you die you don't go to hell, you don't go to heaven. That's it. There's a lot of belief today in that idea that we're just like animals, right? But there's a world of difference. The Bible tells us that God created living creatures, but only into man did He breathe directly from His own nature into man the breath, literally in the Hebrew, of lives. Into Adam, God breathed the plurality of something that has been passed down from generation to generation, and every parent gives it to their child. Life. Soul, spirit. It's propagated from parent to parent. That's why dogs don't have souls and spirits. There is no great happy hunting ground up in the heavens for the animals, as the Indians would have you believe. Right? As far as I know. Right? The Bible doesn't say anything about it. But to man, God breathed in. So we are made in God's image. I think that the best way to explain this is something that was given to us directly from God. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23 says that Paul prays for Christians. I pray, God, that your whole body and soul and spirit will be found blameless at the coming of Christ. There's more to us than mere flesh and blood. There's more than just matter. There's a separation. There's a higher dimension that the world will not acknowledge, or if it does, it gives a very twisted viewpoint to. Our secular, materialistic, atheistic society doesn't want to acknowledge the spiritual, because to acknowledge the spiritual means that we're face to face with this vast dilemma that there is no explanation for outside of some basic absolute revelations from a God. Where did this spiritual come from? They have no answer for that. Right? But the Bible tells us that God formed the physical from the earth. Every one of us will eventually, if we die, go back to the very elements. And yet there was something given to us directly from the mouth of God. We are in His image, in that nature. We're in His nature in that way. He breathed into us the breath of life. God is a spirit. They that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. So what can be argued is that man is a spiritual being. We are like God in that we are spiritual, not merely material. Theologians will have amplified on this, and they say that this breath of life that God gave to us corresponds to God's righteous character, His holy character, His knowledge, that we are able to receive divine revelation and retain it. That at one time Adam was innocent and free and holy. He was inwardly biased to good. And all of these things would have been involved in what God gave to this first man. He had an inclination to please God. He had a supreme love. He had a zeal and a fear for and of God. He had a desire to be working in harmony with God. And you could go on and on describing adjectives that would have described what Adam was like in the beginning. However, even though my mother loves me, even though my wife loves my children, even though we can demonstrate similar attitudes and show dimensions of the spiritual amongst one another, it's very obvious that something's wrong today, isn't it? Where did hate come from? Where did selfishness come from? I don't think God created Adam that way. We'll leave that because we're going to run out of time. But the very first thing to note from Genesis chapter 1 and from Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 is that man's spiritual nature is probably something that he got, and it can be argued strongly that he got directly from the mouth of God. We are different from the animals. Something else about man's nature we see in chapter 1 verse 28. And God said unto Adam and Eve, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. You know what this tells me? I am like God, and you are like God today, I believe, still. Especially in the very beginning, Adam was like God, because just like God, Adam is blessed. We bless God with our mouths today. I'm sure Adam blessed God. Just like God, Adam was told to be fruitful. God is fruitful. He filled this whole earth and has caused it to grow and to bloom and to propagate. God is multiplied. He told Adam to multiply. God fills the earth. Man was told to fill the earth. Some families are trying to do it all by themselves. God has dominion. He told man to have dominion. Do you see that the very potential, the very responsibility, the very opportunities that God gave to the first man were things that only a person that was like the Creator could do? Fish can't fill the land. Birds can't fill the sea. Apes can't subdue the world and have dominion over it. Only man. Only man is made in God's image. So we are spiritual because we've been divinely breathed into, and we are like God in the sense that we have the God-given potential and ability and responsibility to function in the similar way that God functions in the larger realm. In His universe, God has dominion, He fills it, He multiplies, He's fruitful, and He is blessed. In our smaller realm, God gave that to Adam. You know, the Mormons teach that if you go through all the right steps, that eventually you can go to your own planet called Kolob. And you and your celestial wife and your celestial marriage will be able to constantly be producing children. Eternal bliss for a Mormon woman is to be eternally pregnant and to multiply children on Kolob. You can fill your planet. Like to be a Mormon? There's an element of truth there. You know, they've got this concept that man is to have dominion over the world, that man was created by God to be like God, that is to have dominion, to be a ruler, to be king, to be Lord in His planet. But it's really been screwed up today. There are Christians that teach that through economic means, through political manipulations today, that Christians ought to be taking over this world. That's called dominion theology, and you better watch out for it, because it's tied into this health, wealth, and security business that a lot of Christians believe, that it's God's will for us to be healthy, and if you've got disease, you're a sinner and out of the will of God. If you're poor, you're out of the will of God, and so forth. And that's actually preached today in many, many places. You'll see it on television if you watch. Adam was in the beginning created like God to have dominion, but what happened? He lost it. And today, you know who the God of this world is? It's not man. It's the devil. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 3. The God of this age has blinded the minds of those that believe not. And Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1 and 2. The God of the Spirit, the God of this world. How does that go, Paul? The Spirit that now works in the children of disobedience. I forget the other title, but it refers to him as a God. The devil has been given, what? The prince of the power of the air. Okay. The devil was originally an angelic being around the throne of God. And when he fell, he was cast to the earth. For the devil to have rule over this world was a step down, it wasn't a step up. And he was only given that ability when man forfeited his right to be like God through sin. All right, so in his character, man is like God. He's a spiritual being. In his position, man was created like God to have dominion. And in the same chapter, Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, we see that at the end, God looked back on all that He had made. It's a very important commentary. And behold, it was very good. We're talking about what is man like. The Bible tells us that when God was finished, He looked at what He had made and it was very good. Today, the closer you look at humanity, the more you're likely to puke. You know, if you really get a good look at people, we are pretty rotten, right? You can, if you want to delve into my inner nature, if you want to see what I'm really like, talk to my wife. She'll tell you how bad I am. Right? She knows me better than anyone else here. Right? You could probably find a lot of skeletons in everybody's closet because we're pretty bad. Right? But as originally created, man was like God, in God's image and His likeness. That meant he was very good. There was nothing wrong with Adam. There were no skeletons in his closet. He had every inclination to do good. He looked good. He acted good. He smelled good. He felt good. He thought good. The Bible tells us, "O taste and see that the Lord is good." Nehemiah talks about the good hand of the Lord upon him as he brought the remnant back. Moses got a glimpse of the goodness of God on Mount Sinai. See, as originally created, man was like God in his character. He was like God in his position. He was like God in his moral stature. However, when you're talking about man, we're not talking about the original man today. The Christian worldview of man isn't some we don't glory in that one thing because we have to be realistic. We live in the here and the now. And there's more to man than just what he once was, although that's very revealing. Today, we are not just like God, although I think we still are. We are not like God. We're unlike God in a number of ways. First of all, God, no one ever took God and formed him from the dust of the ground. Just by our very nature, we are created finite beings. In that respect, we are totally unlike God. He's eternal both directions. We are eternal from the point of birth. Right? God fills the universe. We fill a body that weighs somewhere between 50 and 400 pounds. You know, we are very limited. Right? Our mental capacities are limited. We are formed from the dust. We are dependent. Psalm 8 verse 5 describes man as being created a little lower than the angels. How can that be? I think in rank, you have God who is pure spirit, infinite. You have spirits created by God who are in the heavenlies, unless they've been judged to the earth. And then you have man who is spiritual, but also tied to a God-given body. And he is, in that respect, lesser than the angels. He's in a lower realm. And then you have the animals and so forth down the line. Isn't it interesting how that Jesus Christ became a man? That he became a little lower than the angels. The very eternal spirit, Jesus Christ himself, became lower than even the spiritual beings and took upon himself the flesh of Abraham, Hebrews 2 tells us, to identify with us. And that tells us something what God thinks about us. David asked, what is man? Well, apparently, in God's sight, man is very valuable. Why? Because he made us like himself, and he values us for that reason. Do you know that when God made a covenant with Noah, you read it in Genesis chapter 9, that God said that if a man spills another man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, because man was what? Made in the image of God. The reason that God intends for people not to be killing one another is because of the great value that God invests in the human being. We are like God. And it's a commentary in our times that when mothers and fathers and doctors and the healthcare establishment is murdering and butchering children by the billions, that corresponding to that lack of value that is attached to the human body, to the human being, is a corresponding anti-God view of man. That man is merely biological, that man is merely matter, that man is an evolutionary result. That God, there is no connection to God. And so therefore, what is the value? You see? You'd have a very interesting argument if you were to go to university and bring up the discussion. What right do you have to believe in law and in the value of the humans, of humanity, if you do not believe in God? God is what makes man valuable, because man is like God. It really exalts the human being. Well, we're out of time, and maybe we could finish this another time, but what is your view of man? You know, you have to realize that you are a very exalted person, that you have the potential to become something that God intended you to be. And someday Jesus Christ is going to return, and he is going to change these vile bodies according to the power with which God is able to subdue all things. See, God is still in ultimate dominion, like we were supposed to be in this realm. But because we forfeited, God has to take us and pull us back up out of the miry clay and set our feet in the rock. He's got to change us all over again. He's got to make us a new creation. And that's what God can do in your life. There's no place for hopelessness in the life of a Christian. There's no... It's wrong. It's absolutely self-defeating to have a bad self-image as a Christian. You should see yourself as something important to God because you are made in his image. You are a spiritual person. And because you are spiritual, you have special goals for being here. We'll talk about that next time. What is the purpose of life? It's intimately tied to the fact that we are created in the image of God. Let's pray. We come to you, Father, and we thank you for your marvelous love for your fantastic program. We'd give anything to be able to go back and to stand in the garden and to see you at work. And our Father, we praise you this morning when we realize that your word teaches that you are able to take us, vile, separated from you, your enemies. Because of your marvelous love, you can recreate us, make us into new creatures. You can renew us in knowledge and understanding. You can make us into the image of Jesus Christ, who is in your express image.